So far, we've seen how we can use a service with a default password, or a service that has not been configured correctly, or a service that came with a backdoor to gain full access to the target computer. We also seen how the basic use of Metasploit using to connect to a backdoor that was installed on the FTP service. Today we're going to have a more advanced look on Metasploit, and we'll see how we use it to run a vulnerability that exists in a certain service. It's a code execution vulnerability which will give us full access to the target computer as well. So back to our results here with Nmap, and we're going to do the same thing that we've been doing for a while. We copy the service name and see if it has any vulnerabilities. So for today, we're having a look on this particular port 139, which has a Samba server version 3.x. So 3 point anything really. So we're going to go to Google just like we did in the previous videos, and we're going to look for Samba 3x exploit. Now, as you can see, there's a number of results. The one that we're interested in, the ones that come in from Rapid7, because as I said, these are the people that make Metasploit. So the exploits that you see there can be used through Metasploit. So we have two examples here. Now, I've actually tried both. The first one doesn't work, so there is a bit of trial and error in this. And the second one is the user map script. It's a command execution vulnerability, as you can see here. So the name of the vulnerability is this. So it's the same thing that we used before with the evil backdoor in the FTP service. This is just a different name that we're going to use. So I'm going to go to Metasploit, and I've already run MSF console, so you can see that the console is running here for me. So I'm going to do a use like we did before yesterday, and then I'm going to put the name of the exploit that I want to use. Then the next thing that we usually do is show options like we did yesterday. So I'm going to do show options. So using these exploits is always pretty much the same. The only difference is the options that you can set for each exploit. So you always do use, and then you put the exploit name, and then you do a show options to see what you can change to work with this exploit. So in the future, you probably will get different exploits than what I have. So every time you want to run an exploit, you do a use exploit name, and then you do show options to see the options that you want to configure. But using the exploits and setting the options and running them is always the same. So I'm showing you a few examples that should cover pretty much everything that you want to do in the future. So again, we need to set up the rhost, which is the IP of the target computer. And we're going to do it the same way that we did before. As I said, it's setting the options is always the same. So we're going to do set rhost, and then we're going to put the IP of the target computer, which is 10.20.14.204. So exactly like we did before, we're using the set to set an option, which is the rhost. So we're going to do a show options. And as you can see now, the rhost has been set correctly. What we need to do now is, here is where things differ from the previous lecture. In the previous lecture, we used a backdoor that was already installed on the target computer. So all we had to do is connect to the backdoor, and then we could run any commands, any Linux commands on the target computer. In today's video, the target computer does not have a backdoor. It has a normal program that has a buffer overflow or a code execution vulnerability. So the program doesn't have any code that allow us to run Linux commands. It has a certain flaw that will let us run a small piece of code. These small pieces of code are called payloads. So what we need to do, we need to create a payload and then run it on the target computer using the vulnerability that we found. That piece of code will allow us to do different things. So the payload is what allows us to do things that are useful to us. Now the payload might let us do Linux commands, and there is other type of payloads we'll look at in the future. So to see the payloads that you can use with this particular exploit, all you have to do is run show payloads. And these are the different type of payloads that you can use. Now I'm going to talk about this again. So payloads are small pieces of code that will be executed on the target computer once the vulnerability has been exploited. So when we exploit the vulnerability, the code that we're going to pick here will be executed, and depending on the type of payload we choose, that payload will do something that is useful to us. So right now you can see that all the payloads are CMD, so that's short for command. So they let you run commands on the target computer, just like Linux commands. And all of them only run on Unix, and that's okay because our target is Linux. And there is two main types. There is bind payloads and there is reverse payloads. The bind payloads, all they do is they open a port on the target computer, and then we connect to that port. The reverse, they do the opposite. So they open a port in my machine, and then they connect from the target computer to my machine. This is useful because the reverse allows us to bypass firewalls. So the firewall will filter any connections going to the target machine. But if the target machine connects to me and I don't have a firewall, then I'll be able to bypass the firewall. So I'm going to use the CMD Unix reverse, or actually I'll use the CMD Unix reverse netcat. The last parts of these payloads are the programming language or the tool that's going to be used to facilitate the connection. So for example, you can see there's payloads written in Perl, in Ruby, or in Python, PHP, or using Netcat, which is a tool that allows connections between computers. So this is the one that I'm going to use. And I'm going to use it the same way you use an exploit. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to use it using the set command. So the same way you set an option, we're going to set payload, so just like an option, to the payload name that we just picked. Now I'm going to do a show options to see if there is any other options that I need to set. And yes, because we picked a payload now, there is more options. So there is an option called lhost, and it's the listening address, which is my own address. So I'm going to get my own IP address using ifconfig. And my own address is 10.20.14.203. So I'm going to close this. And I'm going to set the lhost. So it's like the same way that we set the rhost before. We set the lhost to 10.20. So before we used to do set rhost to set this option. Now we're setting the lhost to set this particular option. So set is really simple. Set, you put the option name and then the value that you want to set it to. Then I'm going to do show options. And now everything seems fine. So we're using this exploit. The rhost is set to this, which is okay. And then the lhost is set to this, which is perfect. And then you can also set the port that you're going to be listening on your current computer. You can actually set it to 80 if you wanted to. That's the port that is used by web browsers. So if you set the L port to 80, the target computer will try to connect to you using port 80, which is never filtered on firewalls because that's the port that web browsers or web servers use. So whenever you access a website, you actually access port 80 on that website. So if you open port 80 on your machine and the target connects to you on 80, then the firewall will think that the target is only browsing the internet. I'm not going to do that now because I have a web server running on port 80 and that will conflict. So I'm just going to set the L port to 555, just for example for you, just to see that you can change any option using the same way, which is set, the option name, and then the value. So I'm going to do show options again. And as you can see, this has been changed to 5555. And I'm going to do exploit to run the exploit. Now, as you can see, it's telling me that session 1 has been opened and the connection is between this device and this device, which is the target and my device. So I'm going to do a PWD or I do an ID. You'll see that I'm root. If I do a uname A, you'll see I'm in the Metasploitable machine. And if I do an ls, I'll be able to list the files and so on. I can use any Linux command just like we did before in the other videos.